Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting. Today we're going to continue our state test review so that when you get to that state test at the end of the year, you know exactly what's going on. Let's go ahead and take a look at what we're talking about today. So we're really looking at the unity and diversity of organisms in their environment. We're going to show how they are dependent on one another. We're going to talk about different cycles of matter. We're also going to talk about something known as a food chain and an energy pyramid. So those are all the things that we're going to discuss today. Let's go ahead and get the ball rolling and get y'all refreshed up on this information. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is cycles of matter. Matter is recycled through living organisms, the atmosphere and Earth's crust. Major biogeochemical cycles include the carbon, nitrogen, and water cycles. Let's take a look at that word and just break it down real quick. It's pretty long. So biogeochemical, right? There are prefixes in here that tells us what's going on. Remember that bio means life, geo as in geology is talking about the earth, and then chemical is the chemicals. So what's going on here is that the chemicals are being cycled through life and Earth's crust. And that's kind of what this is talking about here. We're going to talk about the carbon, nitrogen, and water cycles. Okay? The carbon cycle is used in your body, or the water in your bottle could have been part of a dinosaur's lunch. So the water that is around today, as well as the carbon, is the same carbon and water that's been around on the earth the whole time that the earth has been around, right? So the water you're drinking could have once been part of a dinosaur's lunch. That's kind of an interesting thought to have. So let's talk about the carbon cycle real quick, okay? Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is taken up by photosynthetic organisms and used to make organic molecules such as glucose and other sugars. These organic molecules make their way through the food chain as consumers eat producers, and secondary and tertiary consumers eat primary consumers. Geological processes such as the formation of sedimentary rock and fossil fuels contribute to the carbon cycle over long time scales. Human activities such as burning fossil fuels and deforestation increase carbon in the atmosphere. So we can take carbon out of the atmosphere by doing photosynthesis. Then the photosynthetic organisms will be eaten by other organisms. Remember that glucose has a lot of carbon in it, okay? So now that carbon's moving through living organisms, and then things that humans do that affect the carbon cycle are when we burn fossil fuels as well as cutting down trees. That can all have a detrimental effect on the carbon cycle. Okay, let's look at the nitrogen cycle next, okay? So nitrogen is needed in living organisms. Nitrogen atoms are found in all proteins and in DNA and RNA. Nitrogen makes up the largest portion of Earth's atmosphere. 78% of Earth's atmosphere is nitrogen. Nitrogen in the atmosphere is in the form of N2, which is unusable by most life forms. Nitrogen needs to be fixed into ammonia, which is more usable. Nitrogen can be fixed through lightning strikes and by bacteria living in the soil. Although nitrogen is very abundant in the atmosphere, because fixing it is a difficult process, nitrogen is often a limiting factor in nature and plant growth. If nitrogen is added to soils and fertilizers and then run off into streams, lakes, and rivers, a process known as eutrophication can occur. Eutrophication results in large algae blooms, which can be dangerous because it kills a lot of the fish in the lakes. Okay, let's take a closer look at that nitrogen cycle real quick. Okay, so remember that there's a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere, right? Most of the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen, but it's in a form that we can't use. So what has to happen is it has to be fixed. There's a couple different ways we can fix nitrogen. First of all, we can use these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These nitrogen-fixing bacteria and plants have a mutual beneficial relationship. The plants feed the bacteria, and the bacteria fixes the nitrogen for the plants, and that they need that nitrogen in order to grow. Okay? Another way that we can fix nitrogen is by lightning strikes. Lightning is very, very hot. It's hotter than the surface of the sun, and so it's able to fix nitrogen very quickly, but that's just not a very common or reliable way to fix it. Okay? Then once the nitrogen is fixed, it will be fixed into this ammonia, which is a little more usable for plants and animals, okay? And so that's the gist of the nitrogen cycle there. Let's take a look at the water cycle. This is something that you're probably very familiar with. What you really want to know here is that water in the form on the earth and in oceans and rivers and lakes will evaporate. When it evaporates, it turns from a liquid into a gas. It'll float up into the atmosphere. At a certain point, the atmosphere gets cold enough where that water vapor can condense. So the condensation occurs. When that happens, we form clouds, okay? Eventually, when the humidity gets so high, the atmosphere won't be able to hold any more water, and that water will precipitate in the form of precipitation. And precipitation includes all forms of, it's rain, snow, sleet, hail, all of that is different types of precipitation. You can see there's a lot more going on here. Water can be trapped underground, okay? It can be trapped in plants, and we can use this thing called evapotranspiration. That's when plants release water into the atmosphere. There's a couple more terms here, sublimation and desublimation. This is when the water skips a step and instead goes straight from water into a gas and doesn't have that intermediate process there. Okay, great, so let's keep it going. The next thing I wanted to talk about is greenhouse gases. So this is a chart, and what this is charting is the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. You can see that over from the 1960s to 2020, the amount of carbon dioxide has steadily increased, right? So this is 1960, this is 2020. You can see that we have a lot more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, okay? That might not mean much on its own, but when we overlay this information with the average temperatures on the globe, it starts to make a little bit more sense. So again, this black line is just like the line we were looking at. This is CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And then these bars represent global temperatures. Okay, you can see that the blue, this is when it's kind of cooler, right? And then the red represents it's getting warmer and warmer and warmer. As the carbon dioxide increases, you can see that the average temperature on the globe is also increasing. So carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and so it makes sense that as there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the Earth is getting warmer, okay? Greenhouse gases can be a little confusing, and so I wanted to give you all an analogy to make it a little bit easier to think about. Okay, so greenhouse gases. How do greenhouse gases work? What I want you to do is imagine a car on a hot day with the windows rolled up. The windows will let the light in, right, which warms the car up. But because the windows are rolled up, the heat cannot escape. If the windows were rolled down, the car would not be as hot. This is basically how greenhouse gases work. So again, I'm going to kind of go over this in an analogy. Again, I want you to imagine this car represents the Earth, and the windows represent greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases trap heat on the planet. Okay, so you have your car parked out on a parking lot, there's no shade, and you know that when you come back to your car, it's going to be really, really hot, right? So what's going on is the sun is it's very hot, and it's going to radiate that heat onto your car, right? So the car is getting warmed up. Because the windows are transparent, it lets the light in, right? When the light gets into the car, it'll start to strike the surfaces and the seats, and that's going to warm up the car, right? Because the windows are rolled up, there's nowhere for the heat to go. So the heat just gets trapped in here, right? Okay, so this is an analogy on how greenhouse gases work. If we lower the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, if we lower the windows, then less heat gets trapped and your car is less hot, right? So the same way that rolling down the windows on a hot day keeps the car from getting so hot, if we can keep the greenhouse gases low in the atmosphere, that keeps our planet a little bit warmer. Okay, carbon dioxide is one of the major greenhouse gases that's warming the planet, but there are other greenhouse gases as well. Okay, so real quick, I wanted to look at a food web. So this is a food web. A food web is more complicated than a food chain. It's basically a lot of food chains combined, okay? The reason that food webs are a little bit better is that they show a more complete picture of what's going on. Remember, a food chain is linear. It just shows one organism after the next. In a food web, we have more organisms and we can see more of the relationships that are going on. So in this food web, we can see how important this small fish is, right? Because 3 different organisms eat it. If this fish were to be removed, well, now all 3 of these things have nothing to eat. And so that's really going to break this food web. That would be a bad thing. Something else that you can see in a food web but not a food chain, let's look at this herbivorous duck, right? you can see that it's eating two different things. It eats the aquatic vegetation, but it also eats these bivalves, and that's something that you would not be able to see in a food chain. One more thing I wanted to talk about in food chains and food webs, the arrows point to where the food is going. So you can see that this large fish is eaten by the bald eagle. So the arrow points from the fish to the eagle because the eagle is eating the fish. Great. The last thing I want to talk about is something known as an energy pyramid. This basically shows the amount of energy in an ecosystem. What I want to point out is that the bottom of the pyramid always has the most energy. All energy in food chains and food webs ultimately comes from the sun. The organisms that have the most direct connection to that energy is producers, because they can take sunlight and turn it into food. So there's always the most energy at this bottom layer where the producers are. Every time you go up one trophic level, you're losing 90% of your energy, because most of it is lost in the form of heat. So you always have the most producers, and you always have the least amount of apex predators. It takes a lot of organisms to support an apex predator, okay? So y'all, thank you so much for making it here today. Your teacher has some other work for you to do, so make sure to give that your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.